Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to an episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today with two very special guests. Fan favorite Parker Thompson, formerly known as Startup Jackson, among many other things, and a very special guest, Tim O'Reilly, entrepreneur, author, publisher, investor. Great to have you both on the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Awesome. Parker, why don't you sort of begin by explaining why we are convening here today?
Yeah, so Tim wrote this wonderful piece in Quartz, I think is worth reading maybe a month or two ago now.
This is back in February.
Took us some time to get this podcast scheduled. It's worth taking a read. You can read it before you listen to the rest of this podcast at the end if you think it's interesting, but it's worth reading through. So I saw this article and said, this is a perspective that's worth entrepreneurs considering. And I felt like your audience would get a lot out of thinking about the ideas that Tim put out there. And maybe some of them they'll like, maybe some of them they'll challenge. But I think either way, we're on a default track sometimes in startups and venture capital, and everybody's saying the same thing. So it's useful to step back and think about these ideas.
Yeah, so maybe we should start with the backstory of why I wrote the article.
Please.
And it started with Reid Hoffman's Masters of Scale podcast in the episode in which he said, you should be raising as much money as possible.
Yeah.
And I took exception to that. I said, that's basically the VC talking. That's always good for the VC. It's not always good for the entrepreneur. And, Reid made fairly compelling arguments for it. But as somebody who built a business where I put in $500 to start it and never raised a penny of venture capital, it's not the only way to do it. So Reid and I end up having a debate, literally that was published. It was on CNBC, where we debated this whole point of blitz scaling as a model versus a different approach to business that I practiced. And, I think it went pretty well. It was sort of a bit of an Oxford style debate where they asked the audience at the end what they thought, and I was the clear winner. So there was a lot of sympathy in the audience to this point of view. But anyway, Reid, being who he is, said to me when the book came out, it hadn't come out yet, he said, I hope you write something about it, even though, we disagree. And so I thought, well, I should do that. And didn't do it quite when the book came out, but I followed up on it. And what I really tried to do was to tell the story. I didn't really react to that point about you should raise as much money as possible that was in the back of my mind. What I was mainly reacting to was the marketing framing of the book. So it was even a little bit less the book, but it was like, blitz scaling, this technique, which is, the surest way to create as much value as possible. And I'm like, what do you mean by value? And what it really means is financial value of your exit. And that's not creating value in a business. When I think of, I was just having a debate with a guy who came in to interview me earlier today. I said, look, early in my career, I published a book and Pierre Omidyar used that book to help start eBay, he told me. And I go, that's creating value. I got $35 for it. And I didn't even get that actually because he probably bought it at a bookstore. So I probably got $17 for it. But the world got eBay. And it got everything that Pierre has done since. And the real act of value creation is making something that has an impact in the world. It is not the amount of money that you make as a result of doing that thing.
Right.
So, I think before we get into exactly what the alternatives are and exactly what's wrong and some of the counterfactual issues you talk about, you actually go out of the way in the piece to say, look, blitzscaling isn't bad. It can be very good. It can be appropriate for the right company. So I want to start with a definition of what blitzscaling is and then maybe talk about for whom it is appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Well, Reid talks about blitzscaling as effectively burning money so that you can move so fast that you effectively overwhelm the market. So it's based on the idea of the blitzkrieg from, Nazi Germany warfare. And, if you think about companies that have blitz scaled, Uber is a great example. And in my response, I talk about Uber and Lyft as examples of blitzscaling and ask whether this, in fact, is the right model. But it's really being unreasonable. Reed talks about the early days of PayPal, where he said he was talking with Peter Thiel in the early days. He said, Peter, if you and I were standing on this rooftop throwing $100 bills off the roof as fast as our arms could go, we wouldn't be losing money as fast as we are doing it right now. And he said, but it worked. PayPal grew super fast and they found product market fit and scale. And then they sold for what at the time seemed like a lot of money. And that launched Peter and Reed on their careers. But the thing that I took exception to is this idea that that's a fit for every entrepreneur. And I tried to talk about, and actually I should say Reed sort of brings in this idea that all of the great companies were effectively blitzscaled because, of course, they grew very fast. And I think there's a bit of a sleight of hand there because I don't think that growing very fast is the same as blitzscaling. Blitzscaling is pouring a bunch of money in and growing faster than the market is ready for in order to seize the ground before people are ready.
This would be buying market share with negative unit economics.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the essence of blitzscaling. Because if you look at Google, for example, they grew very fast, but it didn't take very much money. The total amount they raised was $36 million. And it's actually a kind of a convenient number because that's about the same amount of money as Sidecar, which really pioneered the ride-hailing market, raised. And of course, actually, Reed, I think, makes a horrible mistake because he quotes the Glengarry Glen Ross scene where the salesman says, what first prize is?
Steak knives.
Yeah, first prize is Cadillac Eldorado. Second prize is a sack of steak knives. Third prize is you're fired. And of course, Sunil, who was the guy who created the category, was the guy who invented it actually 10 years before any of wrote patents back in 2000. He basically got fired. Effectively, but he raised the same amount of money as Google. And so what I was trying to get at is there's a sort of distortion in capital markets today where it's no longer a matter of letting the market develop over time. There's so much cheap capital flowing around that basically blitzscaling is an artifact of money chasing returns and still see if we can force this thing. And then the question, of course, is that really the right thing for most entrepreneurs? And that's really the question that I think we're here to discuss.
Yeah. So when you think about this article, there's sort of different ways we could think about this problem to the extent you want to characterize it a problem, right? We could think about, what should venture capitalists be doing differently? We could be thinking about what should policymakers be doing differently, if anything.
Yeah.
The main audience in my mind was entrepreneurs. I think it's an interesting article for entrepreneurs. Like, how do you think about where there needs to be change, whether it be policy or cultural? Is it all of these areas? Or?
I think it is all of the areas. I think the very first area is that entrepreneurs have become conditioned, particularly, sort of young, immature entrepreneurs have become conditioned to thinking that the act of starting a business begins with raising money. Mm-hmm. And there's a great story that I tell, I forget what interview it was from, but of the guys who founded RX Bar, the protein bar company, the one that has the fancy labels that says, what's in the package. And they were from, a family that had been in the food business, and these two guys had been roommates in college, and they're in the family kitchen discussing raising money for their startup. And the dad who ran a food business said, you guys should shut the fuck up and go out and sell 1,000 bars. So they went out and they sold 1,000 bars, by hustling, and they found a natural sales network through CrossFit gyms, and they ended up selling the company for, hundreds of millions of dollars, 4 or 5 years later to Kellogg without, I think, ever having raised money.
Yeah, I mean, I think the sleight of hand Reed might accuse you of there is to say, well, look, that's a CPG company. No self-respecting venture capitalist should be thinking about that because there's not network effects there, versus something like Airbnb he did fund where you said maybe blitzscaling was more appropriate.
Right. And he gives a story about Airbnb blitzscaling. And this is a very good, a good case for blitzscaling, and one that I kind of, if I look back at my business career, well, I didn't make that choice at various points and probably, lost some opportunity by that. And that was, they had a copycat in Europe, who was basically had a whole business of knocking off internet startups. And And they said, oh, well, if we got to cut them off in the past, we've got to expand in Europe now. And so they raised a bunch of money and went and did that. And that's, I think, a great example of strategic blitzscaling that I think is one really good case to be made. And I also give the example in my article of a case we're facing with Code for America, the nonprofit that my wife started, where we're working on automatic expungement of criminal records, say when, when states pass a law to decriminalize marijuana, or just even for dealing with 8 people have served their sentence and you want to get it off their record and the systems don't really support it. And you look at that and you go, we have a pretty innovative way of doing it that's low cost, that demonstrates that this thing can be done easily. And of course, you have a set of competitive vendors in the government market who, try to sell governments simple things for a lot of money. And so in some sense, we're racing against other people selling bullshit.
And seems like both those cases are examples where you have positive unit economics. Obviously, in the nonprofit context, that means something different than Airbnb. But Airbnb is fundamentally a sound business. Right?
It is. Yeah. It is absolutely, and that's why I kind of, even though I love Uber and Lyft, and Lyft in particular, I think the entrepreneurs are idealists and my stripe. These are businesses that don't have positive economics, and there's a real question what the business is. That's the thing that I guess I look at all the time. There's one kind of blitzscaling in which you raise money, where your crossover point is. If you grow to a certain point, you will be profitable. There's another kind where maybe you never know and you're just kind of hoping. And there's another kind where maybe it will never be profitable and you spend a bunch of time trying to persuade people they should bet on you anyway, because in the end, the business is the financial exit. And, can you go public without ever, as you're seeing many, many companies do today, go public without ever actually turning into a business that's profitable or even cash flow positive on the basis of the actual transaction with customers. And I consider that a kind of fraud. And I think we will look back on this period in Silicon Valley and it will be called a kind of fraud, just like the mortgages that were, tranches and, these CDOs that blew up the financial economy in the late, 2008, 2009. These are not real businesses. Now, some of them are, and hidden inside this sort of froth, there are businesses that are using blitzscaling correctly. That is, they see the crossover point and they're aiming for it and they're being very strategic about it in the way that Jeff Bezos was. He really is probably the icon in many ways of blitzscaling, somebody who burned money but knew where he was going and how to get there. But when you look at companies that, years and years in are, still losing billions. And when you press on them, you say they still don't even know how they will get to profitability. I consider that a kind of fraud. The right answer for example, for Uber and Lyft, they are going to have to raise prices. And it wouldn't have to be by that much, but it would slow their growth. And then their financial valuation would go down. So here's the way I would tell, if your business is less valuable as a real business than it is as a financial instrument, then maybe you have a problem. And once capital is no longer so free, you're going to get bitten by that.
I'm curious how you think about, you talk in the article about Lyft versus Sidecar versus Uber. I'm wondering how you think about, okay, I'm an entrepreneur, I'm the Sidecar founder. Yeah. How do I think about these ideas? Because naively you would say, well, I lost raising $35 million. I should have raised $350. Is the case? You give a couple examples from your own career that you could feel free to talk about, where you talk about businesses where you looked at a line of business and said, I have a very profitable company. I don't want to play this blitzscaling game. I'm going to sell off this line of business. Should entrepreneurs think that way? I just shouldn't play in this game?
It really depends on who you are. And I guess that's the thing that I think really distinguished my choices about that. And some of it came from just my history as, a business person. I didn't start as a tech entrepreneur. I started as a, small business servicing, as a consulting company servicing clients. And in the course of that business, I saw lots of, tech startups. This is in the early days of, mini computers. I actually did a bunch of work for a company that was a competitor to Sun Microsystems that got put out of business by them eventually. A couple of them, Masscomp and Apollo and so on. And, one of the things that had really struck me was I really liked the companies when they were small. And as they got bigger, I liked them less and less. And the motivations seemed different. And I thought, I don't want to be like that. And, I've sort of once said, and I guess it's probably the thing that I've said that's quoted more often than anything else. It's like, money is like gas in the car. You don't want to run out and be on the side of the road, but you're not taking a tour of gas stations. And I feel like too many people in business are taking a tour of gas stations and they lose sight of what are you trying to build? And I was just looking to create an interesting workplace that would support me and the people who worked with me. I was trying to solve information problems for people, trying to be useful. And I wasn't ever thinking about the financial exit. And a couple of times we did hit on a rocket ship. And, I looked at it and I said, I'd have to take in venture capital. And I thought back to those companies that I'd seen and I went, I don't want to be that. I don't want to lose control of my company and have it be a place that I don't like and then have to start over because I'll be out, and it's just sort of looking at who I was and what I wanted. And so I think just being an entrepreneur, you really have to think about, entrepreneur market fit as well as product market fit.
I guess one way that I think about this and talk to entrepreneurs about this is to say, look, like, your market is destiny, right? And it seems like you're saying that to some extent here. We built this product. The market, to maximize the opportunity, is going to require a bunch of venture capital. Yeah. I don't want to do that, but the market requires it. Therefore, we're going to spin it off, sell it, or let
That's right. Yeah. So we sold GNN, which was the first, web portal, first advertising support website. We sold to AOL because I didn't want to take in venture capital.
Yeah. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things I really liked about this piece was it wasn't saying venture capital is evil and you should get yourself a flannel shirt and move to Portland and start a small business.
No.
Yeah. Which seems to be much of what the sort of the base criticism of venture capital is these days.
No, I think the first, I also talk in the article a little bit about what my partner Bryce is doing with Indie VC, which is to teach entrepreneurs that there's a broad bifurcation in businesses. And yes, some of it is, this is a fast growing, high growth business. This is one way that people divide the market, where blitzscaling is appropriate. And this is a low growth, uninteresting business for investors, right? Notice that's for investors. Mm-hmm. And that's just not how I divide the market. I divide the market into, this is a market that is for customers, and this is a market that is for investors. And I think there are a lot of companies that are for investors. I think that they are effectively financial products.
I guess the way that I think about it, and you and I were talking a little bit before the podcast about the business model of VC. So there's what customers want or need. There's what entrepreneurs are trying to do, the problem they're trying to solve. And then there's these venture capitalists, some of whom are in the room, who have their business model. And it seems to me that some of the problem that leads to people being retrospectively upset about the partnerships they went into with venture capitalists is just being very naive about what the model is, right? Yeah. And so I'd love to hear actually your characterization of the VC business model, and then maybe we'll
Well, I think the fundamental point of the VC business model is you have to raise money. You need the entrepreneur to raise money. And then you need the entrepreneur to grow the business in such a way that they can raise money at a higher valuation so that you can show, and you need to do it quickly so that you show a great IRR to your investors, because that's what your business is being able to collect fees on money from your limiteds and to raise your next fund. And so rapid growth with step ups in valuation is the game that you're in. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, you don't necessarily need a step up in valuation if you have real customers. If you're really trying to build a business for the long term, in fact, you may not want that at all, because you don't want another round. You got perfect product market fit. Google didn't need to raise, once they got to that 36 million, they didn't ever need to raise any more money. And, I think that's a better business overall, and actually even better for the VCs. But there's sort of a way that, in some sense, we're going to work to step up the valuation, get other people to buy in, is a way of manipulating the market.
Yeah, I guess my way of describing it to an entrepreneur would be to say, understand how big a venture capitalist fund is, and then understand what percentage of that fund they're giving you. So if they have a $20 million fund and they're giving you a $250,000 check, they're assuming that check, if you are a good company, is going to return that entire fund. So you can kind of do the math on the multiple and then actually double or triple it again, because they're assuming dilution in subsequent rounds. And that needs to be the magnitude of the exit for their business model to work. And that's fine if that's the way that you see the opportunity. But I think too often what ends up happening is that's not at all how we're thinking about it going in. We're saying, oh, let's raise a little bit of money. I need $1.5 million to make a decent business. And then you wonder why those investors are incented to push you to scale quickly or grow.
And I've seen a lot of businesses that have basically blown up because it was actually had the potential to become a good, steady, growing business, kind of like mine. I mean, over 40 years, I built a business that has a couple $100 million in revenue, that's, profitable, cash flow positive, with lots of money in the bank. But nobody would have invested in that, and they shouldn't have. It wasn't, it took freaking 40 years. But anyway, what we've tried to do with Indie VC is to look for more businesses like that, where you say, okay, what could a venture capitalist bring to a business that's focused on building a business that they don't want to exit from, that they want to just grow and keep doing. And obviously there's a bunch of services that a VC can bring, just in terms of expertise and connections and so on. And also the ability to flip the switch if you discover that you're in the middle of something explosive but what we've tried to do with Indie VC is to create more optionality for entrepreneurs. So we basically have created or I should say Bryce Roberts, my partner, has created it's effectively a convertible note that's repayable through dividends rather than just through conversion. So you can effectively buy out the investor. And it's interesting because we actually had a company in our traditional portfolio that actually did that to, in one of the earlier OATV funds. This company got to be $40-50 million in revenue, generating, $10, $15 million a year in positive cash flow, profit. And they're like, so tell me again why we should be shooting for the moon. We just want to keep sitting under this nice waterfall of money. So can we buy you guys out? And you go, why wouldn't you want to do that? Why would you want to, the VCs might want you to kind of bet big and, go big or go home, but maybe you don't want to go home. Maybe you like the business that you're in and you want to keep doing it.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to see more of this built into the front end of even venture deals, because it seems like there's a real problem in seed venture capital today where, we go into this together and you and I both think this has $1 billion opportunity, and we just learn in retrospect that it actually wasn't. And then what do you do with this perfectly good business that would otherwise be a zero to me? Today, I think our best answer is, well, I'm just mentally going to call it a zero and keep playing for that 1% that's going to return my fund 10 times over. Yeah. And there may be better opportunities, but it becomes messy if you're trying to deal with it after the fact.
That's right. And the entrepreneur really, they kind of have the weight of this cap table, and if they do need to raise more money, they really can't.
Certainly not from venture capitalists.
Yeah, exactly.
Because the next round are looking at it. I think this is particularly a problem in a seed world where it seems to me that a reasonable assumption of entrepreneurs is, well, if someone gave me $2 million, this must be a venture scale opportunity. And the problem is, in fact, there are many seed funds that are writing checks into these things, not really thinking very deliberately about that. Yeah. But once you've raised that $2 million, you're kind of on that track. So I think entrepreneurs should not assume that the venture capitalist necessarily is making a good decision on the front end of that, and sort of think for themselves.
Well, and that they'll keep making the same decision
with more information
ongoing. And there's sort of I think a lot of businesses fail that could have succeeded and found their way through. Now, there is an argument to be made, and a very real argument, that the market is more efficient when you get to that point of failure and move on and people try something else. But if I look at my business career and I go, well, I would never have done a lot of the things that I did. It was all about trying to meet customer need. The first 2 books I published, I mean, we were a consulting company, and then we go, let's put some people to work doing things in their spare time. And the first 2 books I published had print runs of 100 copies each. And those 2 books went on over next 20 years, probably to sell well over 1 million copies, and they're both still in print. I mean, almost 40 years later.
It seems to me you can believe 2 things at the same time. One is that the market is pretty reasonable, right? Yeah. We get a lot of innovation. We could argue whether there could be more or less. The people putting money into this thing are doing reasonably well, and if they're losing money, they're consenting adults. But at the same time, entrepreneurs are sometimes making choices that lead to them wasting years of their lives, or maybe getting into a position where they can't push a business forward. And that in my mind is the non-renewable resource, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
One of the key misalignments is that venture capitalists have much more diversification, many more shots on goal, 20 shots, 50 shots, hundreds of shots, whereas entrepreneur just says they're one shot. A company I've helped start is exploring this sort of product that around income share agreements space. Could you give founders that same diversification by all pooling up all the Village Global founders or Sequoia founders and saying, hey, we're all going to get a certain percentage of each company, so that the entrepreneur now has the diversification that the venture capital that the VC has? Would that solve a key issue for you, Tim, or do you think that's sort of besides the point?
No, I think it's an interesting model. And in fact, my son-in-law has done something like that. He's actually done a couple of innovative things. So this is, again, also expanding the possibility space of how do you do a business, beyond just you go to a VC firm and raise money. He has a company called Other Lab. It's an engineering invention factory, so to speak. And they generally have funded themselves through government grants. So they're really like a federally funded research and development company, but just not a officially chartered one. So, NSF grants, DARPA grants, ARPA-E. So they develop a technology, and then when they actually have it working, they do it for stuff for commercial clients. When they actually have it working, they spin it out. And all of the people, they're in a kind of a cooperative, because all the people who work there get shares in each of the companies. And they've spun out, I don't know, probably a dozen companies, maybe more than that, and some of them quite successful. And so there are other models, and it's well worth just expanding the vocabulary and the thinking with which entrepreneurs, go to market and try to build things. The thing that, to me, needs to shift more than anything else, though, is understanding. I didn't ever finish my quote where I said there's 2 kinds of businesses. The one that's sort of really about where the actual output is stepping up the valuation of your business. And the other is one that's based on cash flow and profit. Are you actually getting people to pay you for what you do? And is that becoming sustainable? Is it a good ongoing business? And we need more of those, in tech.
What happens? I mean, it seems like that must be the end game for all of these businesses, right? Like, we're valuing these things either on growth or on profits. So Amazon, there's a Jeff Bezos quote that I'll paraphrase. It's something to the effect of, you can sell investors growth or you can sell them profits, but don't confuse the two. Yeah. And he's done that successfully for 20 years. Yeah. Presumably that's the story that the Lyfts and the Ubers and so on and so forth are telling themselves. It seems like those businesses become sustainable, maybe at the cost of shareholder value, quote unquote, right? Yeah. But that seems like consenting adults making bets on these things. Is that not okay?
Yeah, it is. I guess where I, kind of look at the difference, Jeff always knew what he was building, and he knew that it was, going to be a successful business, albeit a low margin business originally. And he understood the cash flow dynamics of that business, and it was positive cash flow, even though it wasn't profitable. And the fact is, you can tell that because Jeff raised debt. A lot of people forget when they say, well, Amazon lost billions they didn't lose billions against venture capital. They lost billions against debt, where Jeff borrowed against the cash flow of the business and serviced the debt, with that cash flow.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And, that's one reason why he owns more of the company. And that's, again, another piece of, increasing the vocabulary. Actually, and I had a kind of a wake up call for this, myself when we had started one of my versions of other people's money, was joint ventures. I started my international companies originally as a joint venture, and then eventually used the proceeds of a spin out to buy back that joint venture. We started what was called Safari as a joint venture with Pearson. That was really after the dot-com bust. We just didn't have the money. We also we saw that as a cooperative. We wanted to get our biggest competitor under the tent. But we bought them out, in 2014 after, running as a joint venture for 14 years. And we used debt because the cash flow of the business supported it. And so, effectively, I was sitting there, saying, I wonder if we need to raise money to buy them out. And I actually talked to a friend of mine who's a VC, but more a friend than a VC. He said, Tim, I would love to invest in your business, but I've looked at these financials. Why aren't you doing it with debt? And I love him for that. That was Ralph Turkowitz at ABS Capital. That's really something about, a VC who you should always want to work with is somebody who actually does think about what's good for you.
Well, and hopefully once the VCs are in there thinking about that as well. I mean, the last thing I need is, 100 million's preference on top of my investment where you can build a perfectly good business and we don't get it back. I actually feel like there's quite a few opportunities now to do more debt type offerings for startups and small businesses, and you're starting to see some of those, the Clearbanks of the world. But actually, venture debt is one that really there just are not enough folks thinking about.
But even there, though, I still have to say, it's all too much caught up in the cheap capital that we've seen, really since 2009.
Mm-hmm.
I think that when capital is more expensive, it will be deployed more wisely.
I think that's right. I mean, I think something that I didn't understand until I was in venture, that maybe might not be obvious to the listeners and potentially relevant if you think that there might be a downturn. There's a lot of venture capital because interest rates are effectively zero, and venture is theoretically a 10 or 15% return at a high risk. So that sounds pretty good today. But if it were 1977 and interest rates were, credit card level for houses, that would be a terrible return. And it's not like venture returns go up just because interest rates go up. So we are in this weird world where all of this money is trying to flow in and probably too much into this space. And you can make a bet on that continuing to be true or not continuing to be true. And it may matter to you at some point.
Yeah.
And does that mirror what happened since 2008 or 2009, or is that the sort of the story of?
Well, I think the thing about 2008, 2009 is very different. Was that was really systemic because quite frankly, much as we all love tech, real estate and the whole financial market is actually a much bigger industry, and the fact that banks are much more systemically important to the society than your average tech startup. So if we all go bust, it'll be much more like 2001 than 2009. And I do think that it's somewhere in our near to middle term future that it will go bust. And San Francisco real estate prices are going to come down, and the streets, the roads are going to be empty again, and a lot of people will be moving out of state.
What do you think that looks like? I mean, there's these companies with poor unit economics, right?
Yeah.
So in my mind, bust means, all right, everybody has to right size their business to a positive unit economics of some sort. Maybe the public companies lose some valuation. That doesn't seem like the SF apocalypse as it was in 2001. That seems
I disagree. I mean, what really happens is all these companies that are counting on their next round don't get it.
Mm-hmm.
And they suddenly hit the wall because they're not a real business. They're off the drip. They're dead.
I mean, an Uber and a Lyft, we could think of some examples. It seems to me like you look at an Uber or a Lyft and you say, okay, well, you have to raise your prices.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Uber and Lyft are out of scale. I mean, to me, they're not going to go away.
Yeah.
I mean, once you get to a certain scale, it's very hard to, kill a company. But, there are awful lot of startups that are just a gleam in somebody's eye that, are expecting that they have 3, 4, 5 rounds ahead of them before they get to profitability. And they're just, and they don't have a switch to flip. So I actually do think that there will be, another meltdown. And I do think if I were kind of a budding entrepreneur, the first thing I would be doing is, looking for a business with, real customers who give you money and get you to positive cash flow.
I mean, that certainly seems to me to be an easier business to build in many sorts of ways.
Yeah. Well, there's also just a lot of niches that are not,
that's right.
Being filled while everybody's out there sort of chasing the super high growth business opportunity. And, many, many opportunities. Now, there are also opportunities, I think, that could use real R&D capital, which is kind of, in some ways, a different category.
Yeah, that used to be venture capital, right?
Yeah, that used to be venture capital, and now venture capital is, no, we want to see that you have product market fit, and then we'll give you money.
Well, it's technical innovation versus business model innovation is how I think about it, right? Business model innovation, once you unlock that growth loop, we can, scale our Uber, whereas technical innovation is...
There's sort of another category, though, which I think of as meeting up with the future at the right point. My favorite example of this, both for good and for bad, is Sidewalk Labs. And I look at Sidewalk Labs, I go, they are completely tackling the wrong problem. We're going to build the city of the future, and we're going to build, basically a high-tech suburb for techies. And I go, Jesus, if I look at the 21st century, I go, there are going to be hundreds of millions of people who are being displaced and who are going to be in these, refugee shanty towns. And I go, one of the great opportunities of the 21st century is how do we turn all those refugees into settlers? What does that look like? And that's everything from how would we build a pop-up city that's better than, what they're doing in China? How would we build not just the physical infrastructure, but the social infrastructure of a city, where we could use predictive data to figure out, all these people, how do we pull them together into what looks like a functioning market economy? How do we, what kind of sort of connection to the rest of the world that we need? Where are there new kinds of industries that might fit in? Same thing, that same thing is true. Rebuilding parts of America, for example, that have lost their way. There are new industries.
What kind of innovation do you think is needed there? Because you could naively look at that and say, well, that's a policy problem. That's not a business problem. How do you think about it?
Well, policy problems in many ways are business problems.
Yes, of course.
It's just policy. I think that's really something that we forget. There's way too much of a sort of naive free market philosophy in Silicon Valley. Nobody really realizes just how much the shape of our entire industry is the result of policy.
Well, they're related, but classically people would say, look, the government should address market failures. So let's be sure.
But it's not just market failures. It's in a lot of ways, if you look at, let's take the Green New Deal. There's starting to be people going, actually, all those old coal mines are great. It's like solar plants take up a lot of land. Well, shit, we got this crap land that nobody wants. And they're starting to actually build big solar installations, in Appalachia, and you kind of go, wow, why didn't people see that market opportunity? And quite honestly, it is because there was this massive regulatory capture by fossil fuel companies that were basically keeping that entrepreneurial, opportunity from happening. So sometimes policy is figuring out how do you change the landscape in such a way that entrepreneurs can go to work.
I guess I always thought of that particular one as a classic example of a market failure, which is, look, if you have an implicit subsidy of carbon, of course you produce a bunch of carbon as opposed to a bunch of solar because it's just cheaper because the government is paying you to do it.
Eventually, it is getting cheaper to do.
I mean, it was going to happen.
The markets eventually caught up. It's just slowed it down.
Yeah. All right. And circling back to our topic at hand, or closer to the center of it, you wrote in this piece, and I've always loved this quote, in the short run, the market is a voting machine. In the long run, it's a weighing machine.
That's actually Benjamin Graham.
You quoted it. That could be a Tim O'Reilly quote, but in this case it wasn't. And you say the losses from the blitzscaling mentality are felt not just by entrepreneurs, but by society more broadly. I'm curious if you could expand a little bit on that. Like, what's going to be the legacy of these? We talk about Lyft and Uber, but obviously more broadly, what's going to be the legacy of these companies as they go public, as they take these?
Well, again, when you think about blitzscaling, think very, very broadly. You could make the case that Walmart was a blitzscale company. It's really, I'm mainly talking about this sort of the drive for scale and speed and efficiency and, in some sense, market outperformance. Because in order to have market outperformance, you don't have to grow fast. You have to grow your profits over time eventually. And, in that system, humans are a cost to be eliminated. And so you go, there's a lot of costs. But let's come back specifically to Uber and Lyft. And let's imagine a market that grew naturally. And, when I say naturally, I'm even thinking about tech markets like the personal computer, the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web, there were lots and lots of companies trying lots and lots of things for a long time. It wasn't like, this new market came up, and a bunch of people picked Google and poured a shit ton of money into it and had it take over the world. It's like there were a lot of companies competing, and Google emerged out of nowhere in some sense in a market segment that people thought, wow, that's really not going to amount to anything.
Well, didn't Google emerge after people did that, right? It was the ultimate.
But that's what I'm saying. So there was 10 years of experimentation.
So the winner in this market happened to not be a blitzscaler, if you look at it this way. Because
that's right. That's what I said. I don't think of Google as a blitzscaler. And that's why I look at Uber and Lyft as real anomalies. The model, was really introduced really in 2011.
Don't you think Netscape was a blitzscaler?
Yeah, Netscape was a blitzscaler.
Yes, it seems
to also flamed out.
Yeah, well, they lost Microsoft, which fair enough. It's hard to beat not only the guy with the network effect, but also Internet Explorer. People don't remember it this way, but it was a phenomenal product. Yeah. Their product was actually better when they beat Netscape. So it seems to me that, the exception with Google was that if you look at the 90s, all of the stuff that flamed out just wasn't 10 times better technology. Right? So this
But I guess I'm still saying, like, if you look at the web first started getting commercialized in 93, because that's when we put out Gmail. That was the first commercial website. Amazon's 95, Google's 98. We don't really think of the real sort of internet era really taking off till after the dot-com bust.
I just think this is somewhat counterfactual. I remember the people with the free computer. People would get free computers in my dorm room. You'd run ads on them. I think People PC, was that the business? Yeah. Right? You got those. You've got the Pointcasts of the world. You got all this.
Right. But the point was that the crazy times really started 5-6 years in.
Yeah, it seems like we got better at it. It seems like we just didn't know what we were doing. And so you can look back and say, well, we experimented more, but that seems more a product of our ineffectualness.
Maybe, but I think if you look at the introduction of this sort of, ride-hail model, really starts 2011. Even though Uber was founded in 2008, it was an SMS car. So,
the black
car service. Sidecar and Lyft really start 2011, 2012. And by 2014, like 2 years in, it's like game over because so much capital has poured in to Uber and Lyft that there's no other opportunity in that space.
I'm curious, coming back to this question about what should entrepreneurs here do. It seems like there's a prisoner's dilemma here, where if my competitor raises X amount of money and I don't, I can't build that sustainable business. I'm not sure what ends up becoming.
No, I think that's fair, and certainly you look at Uber and Lyft, both of them raised a lot of money. But, I think one of the things that Lyft did that was quite smart was they said, we're not going to fight on every front. We're just going to do the U.S. market. That'll be our advantage. And I think that is, one way to respond to this, which is with focus.
Although we've seen their filings, and they're no better than Lyft's. Uber's. Their business is no better than Uber's. In fact, it's whatever it is, 10 times smaller in terms of value, or price, not necessarily value.
Right.
They're losing just as much money in this market. They just don't have those other markets to be diversified into.
Yeah. That's fair. Although I think in the end, if they had tried to compete across all, fronts, they would have lost badly.
If they,
And again, I think the blitzscaling image is great, and I actually I kind of advert to this in the piece. General Hans Guderian, who invented the model for Hitler, they kind of swamped, they swamped France, they swamped Belgium, they swamped Poland. And, then they went for Russia and they got overextended and,
Is the lesson there, don't invade Russia in the winter?
Yeah, and I guess there is a point where you look at these companies, it's like it works until it stops working.
Well, Uber pulled out of China.
Right, Uber did pull out of China. And they've sort of managed to, still retrieve some real value there. I think the self-driving car market I actually think self-driving car is a kind of invade Russia in winter for Uber, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And for Lyft. But I also think it's as I actually said in my book back in 2016, it's also kind of fake news, which was how do we convince the market that we will be much more valuable in the future because our economics will be much better.
Profitable,
and again, maybe they really believed it, but it's interesting because I talked with the head of Google's self-driving unit, and I said this to him. Yeah, why is nobody saying that? They can't. They don't really have the ability to win at this. And I just drew that conclusion after they bought Otto. When they bought Otto, and I got a demo in an Otto. This is a grad student project. It's like it was two guys with a big, and they were like, "Can we turn it on yet?" It's like it could stay in the lane. On one little stretch of highway, and it's like this is not worth $800 million. And it was signaling, and it was a lot like, and what it reminded me of was when AOL, which was not really an internet company, bought Waze and GNN and Dave Weatherall's browser, I forget what it was called, to signal to the market that they were an internet company, and they rode that all the way up to buying Time Warner before everybody figured out that they weren't really an internet company; they were a dial-up company that was pretending to be an internet company.
I guess I'm willing to give Uber the benefit of the doubt on this, which is to say, as they went into these projects, because they bought a lab at CMU effectively, right?
Yeah.
They bought an academic lab, they bought Otto, they bought some other things.
Yeah.
I think that they thought at the time that they needed to own this technology.
Yeah.
And what is probably true and what they came to believe was actually we don't need to own the technology. We need to own the users because we believe the technology will become commodified.
Right. But I think that if they'd had less access to capital, they might have made smarter business decisions earlier, realizing that, actually, we are a logistics company. Our fundamental competency is in sort of routing. And I think they could have gone in some very interesting other directions and turned themselves into a platform for logistics.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be true. I mean, you see that in startups, right? You will spend resources proportional to the money that you raise, regardless of whether you apply those resources efficiently at any stage.
Yeah.
It seems like you see that now in Uber's business as they look to food delivery, actually, as a big profitable growth area, which to your point is more thinking about how do we use these resources.
Right. And I think that the thing that's really going to be interesting, I think, long-term for Uber and Lyft is, do they find a business that is actually a good business? Again, the thing that was really nice about Jeff at Amazon was he knew what he had, and he wasn't kidding himself. And and both in positive and negative ways. I remember asking him early on about, wasn't he worried about Google and cloud computing, he said, they have great margins. Google and Microsoft said they have great margins. He said, this is just not going to be as good a business for them for a long time, and so they're not going to know how to invest in it. He says, I'm a retailer. It's a shitty business. There's no business I could be in that wouldn't be better than the one I'm in now. So I can invest in this, and it's a better business for me. He was right. He kind of went all in on it because it was better for him. And so there's, again, something about self-knowledge as an entrepreneur is one of your great weapons. And I think it's really easy to get caught up in chasing somebody else's taillights.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Or infatuated with a lifestyle, which is this judge yourself by valuation.
Well, and just also just kind of like, we have to do this thing. And I think remembering that your job is to see something that nobody else is doing and not to be, me too.
I'm curious how you think about, are there policy opportunities here? So we're talking a lot about sort of the decisions the entrepreneur should make and how they should think about the world. And that's, in my mind, the most actionable thing here. I think venture capitalists are kind of in this world where we have to operate in a world where there's a bunch of other venture capitalists doing stuff. Yeah. Some of those things we might not like. Yeah. And we should just try to find the fit with entrepreneurs where it is win-win to go build these things. Mm-hmm. Do you think there's a set of policy opportunities here that could make tech, but maybe more broadly, healthier and producing more value as opposed to economic value?
Well, I do. Not going to be popular. I think that we have rewarded financial returns over real world returns in our tax policy. If I had a magic wand, I would make capital gains much, much higher. Because you should not make more money just because you have money.
Not capital.
We talk about, economic rents. Capital is really where most of the rents live in our society now. And the fact is, when I think about what we call capital gains today, think about these two different, scenarios. Larry and Sergey start, Google, Mark starts Facebook, Jeff starts Amazon, on down the list, and they put decades of their life into it. And then along comes a public market investor who buys a bunch of their stock and holds it for a year, and they get the same tax treatment. Mm-hmm. Which one needed to be incented to put their ass on the line? Yeah. So I go, there's a kind of capital gains and a kind of tax treatment. If you, for long term, I built this thing, I held it, I made it, and there's a kind of thing that's like I played the market with, and instead of taking my money out in 3 months, I took it out in a year. I go, those are not the same thing at all.
Yeah, I once expressed frustration about this to Erik, who I think is a portfolio founder of yours, right? And said, we could fix this whole dang thing if we just made short-term capital gains 95%. Said, well, yeah, but that's never going to happen.
Yeah, no, I agree.
I, of course, walked away and said, well, that's too bad. And he went and started the long-term stock exchange,
right.
Which I'd love to hear you plug because I think it's so amazing.
Yeah, well, I think LTSE is great. It's a big, bold, crazy idea. And the fundamental idea is the longer you hold shares, the more voting power you have. And so this is a way to encourage investors to actually buy and hold a stock, not just for the entrepreneurs to buy it, effectively to buy and hold their own stock. And I think it would lead to much better outcomes in the long run. And the other thing that I think is really would be and this is really true only for the biggest, most successful companies, but companies should really get out of using stock-based compensation. Because it makes them vulnerable to that short-term pressure. When you think about things like supervoting stock that are supposed to give the founder outsized power, it doesn't really, as long as you pay most of your employees and this huge stock-based component. And a company like Apple or Google or Facebook, they can just pay their employees that amount of cash. And they come out and they're profitable enough. And then they could thumb their noses at Wall Street. Go, yeah, tank our stock. We don't give a shit. We don't actually get anything from you. You know? I mean, what does Apple actually get from Carl Icahn, who basically says, do a buyback for me, spend your cash on me? You know, it's like nothing. He's brought nothing to the table. He bought their paper.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point.
You know, and you know, they could say, great, you know, yeah, we don't need you guys anymore. You know, and the reason why they can't do that is they need the stock to keep going up to be able to pay their employees. And they go, just pay them out in freaking profits.
You know, this is the best argument I've ever heard for super voting shares not mattering.
Yeah.
I never really thought about it that way.
Yeah, they don't, because, you know, you can't hire the best people if the compensation is based in this super money currency of appreciating stock.
Yeah, but of course the tax treatment is different there, so you have bias towards stock-based compensation as well.
Yeah, exactly, and that's again why you have to understand that it's baked into the system to do it this way, and in fact that you can create a discount on it's not as true once you're public, but certainly for startups, you know, it's stock-based compensation is you're getting a tenth of the preferred price typically, and
yeah, which I mean the counter argument there is when Google's paying somebody effectively $2 million a year.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it creates a crazy market for these people. You really got to do something to get them to leave that job and join a startup.
You alluded earlier to in the future, we're going to look back at this time and say it was fraud, or there are elements of it that were fraud about it. I'm curious, you know, we haven't even really gotten into SoftBank, which is probably one of the biggest accelerators of blitzscaling. You know, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how do you think, how's that going to play out? Like, what's going to fundamentally change or stay the same about how we sort of view companies?
I think what's going to happen is a bunch of these companies are going to get big bloody noses, and the whole thing is going to stop until it restarts. It'll be a reset of some kind. But I think there's a huge amount of dumb money floating around right now.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, in the long haul, first of all, I mean, if you read history, you realize that this is just one of many, you know, explosions of value, you know, over the years. And where value gets created is in different places, in different industries, and it doesn't last forever.
Right.
And I think there really is going to be a time when people will look back at Silicon Valley kind of like they look back on, wow, you know, it's crazy, you know, that Andrew Carnegie was the world's richest man, and he made it in steel. Right. You know, and actually there's still steel billionaires in India, you know, being made, you know, and in a time and a place. You know, there's actually cement billionaires in India, you know, and then they'll look at this and go, wow, you know, and they'll visit Silicon Valley kind of like they kind of visit Dearborn, Michigan, you know.
And so how should the Greylock, Sequoias, and other multi-billion-dollar firms reorient themselves, in your view?
You know, I don't really have any advice for them. I mean, you know, again, I should just be clear. These people are way better at making money than I am. You know, I've created a lot of value, and I'm very proud of that. But you know, in terms of turning that value into, you know, lots and lots of money,
right?
That's not my thing. And
maybe we'll close on that. It's interesting. You were talking before this podcast about how, you know, when you write a book, that's $35, and then Pierre Midyar reads that book, is inspired, and then goes and creates eBay. That's a lot of value created by writing that book. Tyler Cowen has a view in Stubborn Attachments that because we should value future lives as much as we value present lives, we should be optimizing for long-term sustainable economic growth, because then it gives more opportunities to future people instead of ourselves. And you seem to have potentially a different view of economic growth when you were talking about, hey, if I'm an entrepreneur, why should I try to go big if I'm happy, you know, I have more than enough money? And Tyler might say, for future generations.
Well, but sustainable economic growth is the point.
Right.
You know, and the fact is hyper-growth sustainable? Now, I will say this, and it's, I just look for an intellectually consistent position. For example, Jeff Bezos at the Wired 25th anniversary celebration said something I thought was the best argument yet for a lot of this. You know, for one scenario, they were asking, why is he investing in space? He said, because I want us to be able to continue to be an energy-intensive civilization. And I go, that's great, because he understands that what we're doing now is not sustainable. And he's saying, here are the things I have to invest in to be able to keep doing that thing that we like doing, which is growing. Now, a lot of what we are doing is we have this idea of hypergrowth where we're just stealing from the future. And I think Jeff's right. It's like there's choices we need to make if we want to continue to be an energy-intensive civilization. And I think there's other choices that, and again, scenario planning is great where you actually stretch the possibility space and you go, oh, we can do it that way, or we could do it by saying we're going to actually make a much more energy-efficient civilization and a much more sustainable civilization. And I think both of those are really good possibilities. And I think it's really important to think through in the long run why we care about capitalism. And it's because it's an engine for human flourishing. It has made the world more prosperous. But that doesn't mean it's perfect and that we can, hand wave away any of the critiques of it. I think the point is it can be better. Our job as entrepreneurs, as policymakers, as concerned citizens should be to say, how do we take this thing which has made the world more prosperous and look at the things that it's doing wrong and make it better? Because it has also been driving inequality. And everybody's kind of going, well, you can't address the inequality without losing that engine of capitalism. And I was telling Parker earlier about reading about Robert Boyd in Scotland in the 1700s, and they're saying you can't get rid of child labor without, ruining this thing which is making us all so prosperous. And I was like, no, clearly we can see from where we are now that was wrong. And, it looks to me like you go, well, the idea that we cannot have a prosperous, growing civilization while dealing with economic inequality, while dealing with the environmental impact, all of these things, when we bring those constraints into play, we can build a growing, prosperous economy that makes everybody happier than one in which we're forced to exploit people, both as workers and as consumers, in pursuit of making company stock prices go up.
Yeah. And last question: your biggest recommendation to help reduce inequality would be go back to capital gains, or are there any other policy or?
Well, I think in a lot of ways I would just draw a broader frame because I'm not a tax policy expert. You really have to do the math. But I would say that it seems to me that tax policy is kind of analogous to Facebook's algorithms or Google's algorithms when we say, what's driving the behavior, the incentives in our society? And so when we're saying, hey, Facebook, you've got something wrong. We need you to fix your algorithms. We need to do the same thing. And I think tax policy is a lot of where that happens. It's not the only place that it happens, but it's a big place.
I'm curious. So people often talk about inequality as the first order problem, right? As opposed to something like poverty. Do you see inequality as the first order problem?
No, I see the not inequality per se. Again, I feel like it's the everybody likes to make it into absolutes.
Yeah.
It's like, Paul Graham, I think, once said, it's like if you're
hunting me.
Well, yeah, you're hunting me, or, you're saying there could be no Larry and Sergey. I think that's bullshit.
Yeah.
It's like, there was a time when, again, I think about the founding story of Silicon Valley, people didn't have to make billions of dollars.
Well, but you might look at some of the Democratic frontrunners today, right? I think about Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders' rhetoric about inequality. Yeah. And it really seems to me that they are thinking about inequality as a first order problem.
Yeah, and they're thinking about it very narrowly. I agree. I think when I think about inequality, I think about things like just the assumption that the math, effectively, that drives Silicon Valley choices. Let me give you an example of this. When I went to design a stock option plan for my company, as I kind of go, we got to actually start thinking about this after, Anyways, my first cut was, as I thought about it, without any consultants, without whatever, I just said, okay, there's two things that we value. We value that people make differential contribution. There's some inequality in the system. Some people are more valuable than others. And I said, and look, what we pay people as salary is a good proxy for that. And we also value that people have been here a long time and have helped to build this thing. the equivalent of capital gains, right? If you were here 20 years ago and you built it from there to here, we value that. So I came up with a stock option plan that basically was some multiplication factor between those two things, proportional to salary and proportional to length of service. And it came out unequal, but not radically unequal. The people at the bottom were like maybe one order of magnitude away from the people at the top. And that seemed like a pretty fair system to me. Mm-hmm. And, maybe, and again, maybe you could get 20 times. It's the same thing like CEO pay. You hear all these ratios. And then you go get the stock option consultants. And they go, no, that's not how it works at all. If you want to attract the top talent, and you look at how a typical Silicon Valley stock plan is designed, this is a machine for inequality. The person, each level down is an order of magnitude less than the level before. So literally, by the time you get to the bottom of the stock option stack, people at the bottom are getting 1/10,000th or 100,000th of what the people at the top are getting. And you tell me that you think that's really fair, that people at the top are worth 100,000 times, what people at the bottom are worth? And so I guess I just feel like we need to question, how much equality or inequality, is too much. Just like we go, when does it become an externality? And in fact, the fact that we have people who are not making enough to live on is an externality. The other thing that I think is a real category error that confuses this whole thing is I don't think we understand the real source of where a lot of Silicon Valley wealth comes from. And it really is in the financial markets. And that really changes how you think about things. So again, diagnosing the problem correctly. And the way I like to think about this is every time I hear somebody say, Amazon should pay its workers more. After all, Jeff Bezos is worth $159 billion and was before he got divorced. And people are not making minimum wage. I go, they don't actually understand that Jeff Bezos is worth $159 billion precisely because he pays those people that money. And it's not like he could take that and spread it over those people, because guess what? Jeff Bezos' actual, share of the pie is not that big, because the pie is not that big. I've actually done the math.
Yeah, I've done the math as well.
He'd be worth like $4 billion if he had his share of the ownership of Amazon's collective profits over years. And actually the profits of the e-commerce business, there's just not that much to go around. Yeah. And so there's sort of a level that we live in two different financial systems, two different economies, and there's a set of people who figured out that the way you make lots and lots of money is in this second betting economy, and the people who are not in that economy are just kind of screwed. And I think that we need to look at that and debug it a little bit. And I think you can have there's a hell of a lot of inequality that can be removed between the scale at which the people at the top are being compensated, the people at the bottom, and we've plenty to go around, and I think we could do better.
To make a plug on this stock compensation piece, I don't know if you saw this. Andrew Mason, who founded Groupon when he founded his next company, he put together a really thoughtful stock compensation plan, and it sort of was popular for a day, and everybody kind of read it and forgot about it. But I just thought this thing was super interesting.
I'll go look for it.
It's worth looking at, and sort of thinks about how you design a system where if the thing is a $100 billion company, sort of says, well, I don't need $100 billion. No one needs that much money, right? So there's sort of a threshold over which the returns start getting distributed in a more even way.
I like it,
And I think, to me, this is a really interesting tool that would create some really interesting dynamics in early stage startups in terms of, I think we have this problem where, to Erik's point earlier, if you've got a portfolio of one every year or two, it's financially rational to say sort of like, where's the next place to jump? how do I diversify my portfolio?
Yeah.
So it leads to this crazy thing in Silicon Valley where everybody's spending 1 or 2 years at a place and then jumping somewhere else. And
I think there's a lot of interesting models from the past. And it's interesting, this book that I've been reading recently called The Benevolent Capitalist, it's kind of a history of a lot of these attempts. And one that's very relevant to that is J.C. Penney. I was not really aware that their original model, that he came up with was he basically, each new store, the manager was sort of like the founder of a new store and got a cut. And then it got too complicated because there were every store was a special deal. And then it became this thing where everybody got ownership, but it was sort of proportional to the size of their store and its profitability. And then they basically got dividends out from the performance of all the stores. And that worked really well until J.C. Penney got overextended. He kind of, it was so successful and he basically took a bunch of his money and he bought into banking in the late 20s.
I don't know how that story went.
And that went very badly for him, and he had to sell all this. He basically they had to sell a bunch of company stock to outside investors, and at that point the whole thing was over. But there is that. There are alternate models, and I think there's also alternate models just even in look at a co-op like REI. It's like they perform better than all their public market competitors in every real world measure, same store sales, growth, et cetera, et cetera. They just don't make more money for their investors because they don't have investors. They give it back to their customers. And, we just lose sight and we don't talk enough about alternate models for running a business.
Yeah, a book that I always love to plug, I think I probably tried to get you to read it at some point, Erik, is a book called The Mystery of Capital, which is effectively the book is really about how do you design emerging economies such that they create wealth, right? And he talks about sort of you can pour a bunch of aid in, doesn't work, but if you create certain structures, legal, regulatory, whatever, people can do fine for themselves. But my takeaway from this book was, we can just create a fiction, right? This contract between you and I, stock, whatever it is, right? Stock is one fiction. Not a real thing. We just kind of make up this concept and then we can use it to create value or miscreate value, however you want to think about it. And it caused me to think more about, well, maybe I should approach this deal from first principles. You're the entrepreneur, I'm the investor. Yeah. We can just take this note off the shelf that Paul Graham wrote, or we can actually just think about an agreement that is better for us. Yeah. And something that I'm excited about today is it seems like there are more and more. Venture was the alternative model, and it still is relatively tiny, but it seems in the modern context like it is the default for far too many people. Yeah. And now you're starting to see the indie VCs of the world and the Tiny's and the long-term stock exchange, and it seems like there is this proliferation of new good ideas that might be better fits for entrepreneurs. I'm sure we could, there are a bunch we didn't list here. I'm excited about this period, but also I think that once you see an alternative, you start to say, well, maybe I can think of one too, as opposed to just accepting the default. So my hope would be that a takeaway for entrepreneurs listening to this is, hey, look, if the way that everybody else does it doesn't make sense for you, come up with a better idea.
I like that.
So I would be curious. I don't know if you had any other questions, Erik, but I would just be curious to hear, in closing, what kind of advice you would have for entrepreneurs who, are getting ready to go build something, or they've started building something and they're trying to figure out, how to make good decisions for themselves and their companies.
I guess the main thing I would say is you have to know what you are trying. Well, no, I take it back. No, it's not right. I was going to say you have to know what you're trying to build. And I go, that's not true. I didn't know what I was trying to build. I knew what I wanted it to feel like along the way. And I knew, a bunch of conditions that I wanted to meet. But, kind of understand,
You knew what trade-offs you were and weren't willing to make.
Knowing yourself and knowing your market and trying to get a fit between yourself and your market and raising money as a tool, not as it's a tactic, not a strategy. And realizing that there are a lot of different ways to raise money. particularly if you have positive cash flow. We've had this massive distortion because of ad-supported businesses. And if you're not in an ad-supported business, you may actually find that figuring out how to price your stuff so that people pay you enough to do it is a good idea. And I think there's a lot more economic work that needs to be done by companies to understand how to be good at their business. And that's a combination of financial understanding as well as everything else. And I think I wrote a piece years ago called How I Failed. It was sort of really about how it took me too long to get a really good CFO, and how somebody who really helps you understand the financial dynamics of your business is super important. Because you can have great product, you can have great marketing, and if you don't get the financial side right, you can really do badly. I look at, just to give you a brief example, this is not really, we're running awfully long here. In the 90s, when I was primarily a book publisher, our average revenue per title across all our books was $250,000. After the dot-com bust, it fell to $60,000. During the 90s, we continually had to sell things in order to meet payroll. We basically had, we sold GNN, we, sold something called Web Review that we created as a joint venture with AOL. We sold, we had fun, I don't remember when we sold Blogger, that was about 2003 or so, but we had invested in Blogger, we had Google stock, which we ended up having to sell. Well, rather than holding on to, we had to sell our AOL stock rather than holding on to it because we needed to meet payroll. And then after the dot-com bust, with a really good financial person, our average revenue per title on our books fell to $60,000, like a quarter of what it had been. And over the 20 years since we put, $30, $40 million in the bank, and again, we did get into other businesses as well, but really the point was, she went out and she renegotiated contracts, focused on efficiency. We just really kind of ran a much tighter ship because we had to, and suddenly we're putting money in the bank on what from a top line basis was a way worse business. And I think that one of the things that too much cheap capital does, it makes you forget that running a tight ship matters.
On that note, Tim O'Reilly, Parker Thompson, this has been a fantastic episode. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.